My name is Adrian. My name is Adrian Martinez. I'm the director of La Ruta del Clima. It's a Costa Rican-based NGO. I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Eastern Finland, and I'm the co-coordinator of the Climate Action Network Loss and Damage Working Group. And well, yeah, it's very nice to be here, and I'm super happy to answer the questions that you may have regarding loss and damage and climate risks.
So we actually prepared a few questions already, and Bradley and we will, set them forward to you, Adrian. And then in case there are any additional ones or comments, then of course, you may always raise your hand and then just sort of jump into the discussion.
So our first question is the most basic of them all, but probably the broadest. And it's, what is climate justice and what is loss and damage? There we go. And how does it relate to climate justice?
Sure. I think the best way to explain it is to go through the origins of climate change. So we have, of course, the causes of climate change that are the emissions, and then you have the issue of reducing emissions because it generates changes in our atmosphere, and then it affects our our climate and how it reacts and how it manifests itself in our regions, in our territories, and so on. And this generates some risk, and that is where adaptation comes in, to try to reduce the risk of the impacts of the changes of climate that we feel in, for example, with flooding, with rains, with droughts, with extreme weather events such as hurricanes or typhoons, or with slow onset events, for example, such as sea level rise or desertification in many places. So the changes that we did, that in carbon intensive economies did to our climate, to our atmosphere, and how it interacts with the different I cannot say the word in English, but the water and related cycles that we have in our ecosystem generates increased risk in populations. So, and it's very related to the context of each population. So it varies, and from community to community, from country to country. And to face that, we have adaptation that many of you may know what it is, that tries to generate changes so our system may cope with these changes, with these impacts that the climate is having on our daily lives and our system, being political, economic, or cultural. But sometimes, due to the limits of adaptation, because of the climate impacts are so big, because the emissions have been so big for so many decades already, there is a residual risk that cannot be reduced or cannot be avoided. And since this residual risk remains, then it impacts the lives of people and impacts the ecosystems. And this residual risk that harms people, that harms ecosystems, that harms economies, is what we call loss and damage. It can be things that can be repaired, for example, or things that are completely lost. And this generate exponential problems in terms of the social, political, and economic systems of communities across the world, especially if they're more vulnerable. The impacts of climate change happen disproportionately to communities. So there is not a correlation between how much emissions you enjoyed and emitted to develop your economy in regards to how much climate impacts are you receiving. So it is usually disproportional in terms of those that have emitted and enjoyed carbon emissions the least, that are having the greatest cost in terms of the residual risks that they suffer, and then the loss and damage that they have to endure. And they endure it either by losing lives, or by losing infrastructure, or by losing conditions to have a prosperous life, in health, losing culture, losing land, and so on. So when we talk about climate justice, it ties back in terms of loss and damage to this idea that there is a common but differentiated responsibility in terms of the causes and then the effects of climate change. And the adverse effects of climate change at the end are not only the measures that you have to invest to reduce risk to adaptation, but the losses and damages that result at the end. And these losses and damages are inferred in terms that they are paid for by people that didn't cause really the climate crisis that we're on, and that is transforming. So it's not only an issue that it generates a loss once in the lifespan or in time, but it transforms the landscape and the social natural relationships that people have in their communities with their environment. For example, they're no longer able to depend on rain. They're no longer able to depend on the crops that they have. They're no longer able to practice the same cultural traditions or cultural practices in terms of farming or economic practices or political structures, because their landscape and the relationship that their landscape have with their ecosystems and with themselves is changing in ways that are mostly adverse to life and adverse to the enjoyment of their human rights. And this generates a transgenerational problem. And that's why, besides climate justice, is usually included intergenerational equity in this discussion, because it's something that is not only affecting people and communities and economies right now, but it's something that will be inherited to the future generations. And it's something that will define who these people can be. And with this, for example, I think that we have been working on in Central America, our NGO, is becoming aware that the trauma regarding climate impact and loss and damage is something that is also transgenerational. And one of the clear examples that we were talking about in the last conference in Bonn in June was, for example, taking the example of forced human mobility. And one of my colleagues visiting one of a country in a community in Central America was talking with a mom, and she was telling my colleague that once a flood happened, they had nothing left but a car. And it was so harsh, the prospect of their kids staying there, that they sold the car and sent their kids 9 years old across borders to the United States. And it took that mom at least 6 months to know that the kids actually arrived to their family in the US, and even though they went alone. And then you start thinking not only about the suffering of the mother and of the family that had to make this decision to send their kids away, but also of the feeling of the kids themselves and what they will inherit to their kids in the future, knowing that they were separated and their parents rather have them being displaced and sent alone across dangerous borders where they could be raped, where they could die, where they could be kidnapped, where they could be killed, and knowing that they don't have a place to come back because the place where they come from is so dangerous that it was safer to send them alone through these dangerous borders, being 9 years of age. So this is defining communities, this is defining peoples. So this idea of justice, of responsibility, of why this happened and who benefited and who should be responsible on how to deal with this is one of the sort of connections between responsibility, equity, and climate justice in terms of loss and damage.
Thank you. This was a really great first introduction into the topic, and you already touched upon it a little bit, but who is most impacted by this, by loss and damage?
Well, usually, and especially when you read any climate and human rights, you will see the phrases and it repeats itself. Women, children, the elderly, indigenous people, people under poverty, anyone that is marginalized in any form in a society, those are the most affected because those are already the most vulnerable. And then who specifically in the world, there are certain hotspots, for example, and we can talk about the Pacific Islands, we can talk about Central America, we can talk about Bangladesh, specific places because of not only about the political, social, economic context, but because of their location, that are specifically affected, the Caribbean, for example, due to climate change. And one of the issues, for example, one example is, for example, the hurricane that is now heading from Venezuela all the way to Central America, which is following the same path that many hurricanes have followed in recent years. So it's the location, but also the context, and the context is also defined by racism, discrimination, imperialism, and colonization, especially because these are places where colonial powers have extracted and continuously extract many resources. And correlated to this are places, for example, like my country, that has 0.02% of global emissions historically. And yet the burden that countries like mine in Central America have to bear in terms of our future due to loss and damage, it's estimated to be globally more than 5 times what it costs to do adaptation or mitigation altogether. So it comes to a point that the loss, if you include, for example, non-economic loss and damage in terms of displacement, loss of historic identity, loss of culture, loss of your place of origin, that it is of a magnitude that it cannot be fully rectified, even if there was a will to be rectified. And this is what communities in the global south and some in the global north, for example, are also forced to endure, even though their carbon footprint may be very small.
That's actually the perfect intro to the next question. It's a biggie. It's how do you allocate funds for loss and damage? So who should get how much and for what? And then on top of it, how do you get rich countries to actually pay for it?
Yeah, well, loss and damage, although it seems like something new because there is so little in the international community and in soft law or international law developed in the last 30 years, has been a topic that has been present since the negotiations of the UNFCCC itself, 3 decades or more ago. So it's not a new topic. And these discussions that we now have on specifically this issue that Bradley asked are not new. There has been in the past 3 decades cycles of dialogue where countries from the global south or big NGOs like WWF have proposed mechanisms of how to monitor and how to fund and how to structure financial mechanisms to address loss and damage. And however, it has consistently blocked by the US and European countries because that's something that they do not want to be responsible about. But when we talk about mechanisms and what could it be, recently there was a proposal by CAN International on how could this be structured. But at least from my perspective, before we start dreaming of a mechanism to distribute funds, which could be many ways depending on how countries decide to agree on it, what we should start deciding, first of all, is defining what is loss and damage, because the UNFCCC has refused to define loss and damage, despite that it has an article in its Paris Agreement that mentioned loss and damage. There is not a clear understanding beyond academic literature exactly what it is. Then there is no standardized criteria to assess, report, or monitor loss and damage, which generates a problem for victims of climate impacts, because you don't have any means or to register or record what is happening to you and how you're being affected. So in some way, there's a systemic violence that it is planned for that suffering that you're enduring not to exist, because there is not a place within the UNFCCC, within the international climate regime, where you could even inform that. It indirectly, it could be informed through NDCs, but nobody assesses it. And it is not comparable because there's no criteria to, for example, tell you how to methodologically determine loss and damage in the economic dimension or loss and damage in the non-economic dimension, for example, in terms of losing language or losing culture or losing history or losing any of their cultural values that are in danger. So I would start that there could be many ways. And one of the things that a financial mechanism has to have is that it should not be loans. It should not profit from the victims. For example, when insurance schemes are proposed as a solution, it should not be on those that have the least responsibility to then have to pay premiums and take from their pockets beyond what they're already paying for to deal with loss and damage. And it should be quick and transparent. One of the other things that this sort of financial mechanism should have is the participation in terms of the assessment of loss and damage of the people that are affected. And that's one of the things that we really care about in La Ruta del Clima, because especially when we deal with non-economic losses, is on the perspective and on the opinion of those that are losing and suffering, and for example, what is of value. And for example, and you could see it in terms of religious value of a piece of land. To me, it could just be a square meter that has a market value, but for some people might be a burial site or a place where you did a ancestral tradition or so on, and have a very significant value. And to me, it might be just an algae. It might be the essential ingredient to your town's cultural dish. I have no idea of those details. So how to register and how to appreciate that, and also to understand that we do not feel the same risk. To me, losing a TV might be just 200 euros. To you might be half a year's pay, or the effort of your whole family to get it. It is not the same perspective of what implies a loss to different people. So it has to be very contextual. It has to be transparent, participatory, and easy to access, because one of the things that many countries have made clear, especially global south countries, is that current mechanisms of climate finance are so complex in terms of accessing finance for mitigation and adaptation, that if you're thinking that you're going to have the same scheme to have vulnerable communities that are in extreme need to access resources, go through years and extreme and require a lot of resources to request money, then they simply won't access it. So at least those are the things that have been talked. But the issue on this and why I have this answer that is very broad is because we're not even in the point that we're allowed to actually discuss about this. We're on the point of 3 decades of trying to conquer an agenda item to consistently talk about this. And apparently today we did. At least the UNFCCC Secretariat accepted the request of the G77 plus China, basically the Global South, to include or to have it discussed as an agenda item, loss and damage in COP27. This depends in what happens in the decision itself and the position of global north countries when the COP27 starts. But it has taken 3 decades just to get there. So yes, there's a lot to talk about the financial mechanisms and the details. But in general sense, this is sort of what the ideas that I have on it.
Thank you. Is there for now any comment that anyone would like to add before I go to, yes, Gary?
No, sorry.
George, yeah.
But from me, for sure, because you mentioned a few words which I haven't heard before, this forced human mobility, which is really kind of interesting phrase. And maybe it should be used more often when we talk about refugees coming from to our region from Syria or from the Middle East, because they lose their livelihood. They don't have any more possibility to cultivate their lands because of the extreme hot weather in those regions. I have one important question which is connected to solidarity, because I think that to make this loss and damage on a certain way more accepted by the wider society in Europe, we should also understand that or we should be more aware of those solidarity issues, that we have to support those ones who are in need. So how do you see this loss and damage versus solidarity from the developed countries?
Sure. So I'll address the first comment on human mobility and then solidarity and so on. So when we talk about human mobility, and at least from our perspective, we like it to frame it that human mobility, even across borders, is a human right, and anyone has a right to cross a border. It is not a crime. It can be regulated, but it should be allowed because it is a right. Beyond that, when we talk about human mobility in the context of the climate crisis, yes, there is forced human mobility, people that have to flee within their country or across borders to ensure their well-being, ensure their human rights. But sometimes what we forget, and we got reminded about this in the research that we're doing in Central America, is the inability of people in the context of loss and damage, those that are forced to stay behind. And in Central America, many men go to the US to work, but most women stay taking care of the kids and the elderly behind and endure the dire effects of climate impacts. And that is probably the most important thing about human mobility. Some may choose also not to leave, because most people, and I think that is the reality with people across the world, most people like their town. Most people don't want to leave their home. Most people are comfortable where they're born in. Sometimes, and especially due to climate change, living where they're from becomes dangerous because it is not longer providing the minimum conditions to have their livelihoods or security or health. But many people cannot leave because, so those that have some degree of privilege manage to live. And some that are, for example, discriminated, or for example, women that lack the resources or are expected to perform a specific gender role, stay behind. And there's communities of only women in Central America that have been left behind or have stayed behind due to climate change and due to other contexts within the context of climate crisis. And then with solidarity, so that is a thorny issue. I completely agree that there should be solidarity, and as stated in the Rio Declaration and stated in the Stockholm Declaration, in terms of developing responsibility due to transboundary environmental harm, we should develop that. I think solidarity in general is a very important value, but the thing is that climate change is it's a person-made issue, and it is an issue about equity and responsibility. And the idea, for example, that has been proposed that sort of puts in question and makes me doubt about solidarity in terms of loss and damage is when you try to frame it in terms of aid, in terms of humanitarian aid or charity or support to those that are in need. And the issue is that, for example, if I crash your car, you would not accept me to crowdfund for you to sort of fix it. You would expect me to fix it because I crashed it. And this is sort of the issue with humanitarian aid that has been proposed, for example, by Switzerland and Denmark and the EU recently at the UNFCCC as one of the ways to address loss and damage. People in vulnerable communities have not cause what they're suffering. There is a cost that is made by carbon-intensive economies that have profited and developed due to carbon emissions. And that has generated transboundary environmental harm that is manifested in climate impacts and generates harm. And just as the Stockholm Declaration and the Principle 13 of the Rio Declaration states, we should develop international law to address liability and responsibility due to environmental harm, even if it is transboundary. And that is the issue with loss and damage. I think in any case, there won't be enough resources or enough political will to ever repay the mess that loss and damage is for vulnerable communities and the transformation that is doing to the ecosystems and the landscape there. But we should at least address it from responsibility and not from aid, because people don't require aid for something that a third party has committed, has cost on them. So that is a significant political difference, at least from our perspective, in respect for example, the position of Switzerland or the European Union. And it's something that countries such as Mexico, Honduras, or even negotiating groups such as ILAC in the UNFCCC has stated very plainly: solidarity, humanitarian aid for many other issues, for example, that are beyond human control. It's very acceptable, and everybody should be promote that and take that on account. But when it is something that is caused by political decisions, for example, the decision of Germany currently of restart coal and expand and reignite coal exploitation in Colombia to fuel its energy and destroy more rivers because of the current energy crisis it has, well, that's on them. And that generates consequences. And those consequences should be found liable for those decisions, because those are economic, political decisions, not mysterious or natural events.
I think, Versha, you also had your hand up. Is that correct?
Yeah, try and backtrack. I mean, it's so, I've taken in everything you're saying. It's really, really interesting and important to hear for me personally as well. I think what I wanted to say earlier was it's really difficult to hear that there is no way of defining the sort of the financial mechanisms in order to kind of define loss and damage where you are. That's very difficult, you know, all the impacts that you encounter. And there's no way of accounting that into a package of what you need to kind of to help you. So that was just a comment on what you were saying earlier. And I'll try and keep this very concise, because obviously we want to hear much more of what you're saying. But I'm deliberating. I'm working on a personal project in my spare time related to islands and how they're impacted with climate change. And, you know, I live in the UK, so I can only deal with the region around me. So it's very different to what you're experiencing. And I completely respect that they're kind of poles apart, what you're experiencing there to what we experience here. But the messaging that I will be promoting in this project is basically a call to rethink the exploitation of fossil fuels. That's the end result, which I think is common for both of us in what you're trying to do and what I'm trying to do as well. But yeah, so I'm deliberating on how to incorporate the messaging about loss and damaging on islands in the developing world as well into my project, because there's such a disparity between how we suffer here and the funding available, and you know, and what you need, you know, and yet we both need the same thing, like to end the use of fossil fuels, you know. And I think it's about the addressing what you're saying about responsibility. You know, if we can amplify this message, if we can get people to join the dots between climate change and the impacts and the use of fossil fuels, you know, there's a, you know, if we can make, you know, people join those dots, that the use of fossil fuel is causing, you know, it may go some way to kind of, you know, further this.
I think to sort of help you with this dilemma that you have, even though I think we have, even though there is a very solid moral and justice argument on this issue of loss and damage, there's also a very political and pragmatic reality that differentiates, for example, one island in the north and one island in the south. Is that the island in the north, even though does have the power to stop emissions and does have the power to reduce the end consequences of this cycle of carbon. While people in the South may have the legitimacy to talk about justice and may have a better understanding of the dire effects and the scale and the complexity of loss and damage in their lives and in the lives of future generations, they do not have the power and they are not in control of this cycle. And so that is one like crude reality. I can get very angry. I can make very smart comments. I can write. I might be right in my legal arguments. I might be right in my political arguments, but it depends on the people that control the governments and the power in the carbon intensive economies that are usually not in these vulnerable places to regulate, either to stop or decrease or stall the carbon cycle that we're on. So that is probably one of the easiest connections. It will be very important for you to have a dialogue with people on those islands to see the end of the pipe consequences of this carbon cycle, but also be aware that most of those people do not have the control of the companies, of the political decisions that ignite this cycle. It is probably the people in your island that do. So that is a very special connection. And yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I just, yeah, I guess as governments, they can change the use of fossil fuels. They can rethink it and they can make the decisions that we need to make to stop using oil and gas. But as people, as, you know, people that live here, and even I see it happening, it makes me just as angry as it makes you, I would say. You know, I look at, you know, what these communities are going through, what you're going through. I mean, I'm a climate change activist, and there's all sorts of grassroots movements and organizations campaigning heavily, you know, urgently trying to call for the end, you know, to stop fossil fuel usage. And even I feel helpless. I feel helpless that I can't change this, but, you know, this is my little project is maybe doing my...
And I completely understand, because I also have privilege within my community. I am not from one of those communities that are now currently directly affected. I have the privilege to escape from that, at least for probably the next years. Eventually, I think everybody within certain regions will be extremely affected. And eventually we all will be in somewhat affected by loss and damage. But what I always say, how do I measure my activism? How do I know when I'm overstepping, when I'm maybe too angry or not angry enough, when I'm not being bold? Is try to think about the context of those that are actually from those places. And that is all I can do. And probably that's all you can do. So when they tell you maybe you're not, maybe you're too bold, maybe you're too pragmatic, maybe you're being too radical, well, I mean, check with what you think is actually leaving those families in the places where, for example, in Bangladesh or in the Pacific Islands or in Central America or in north of Africa, what are they living on? Even in the USA, for example, when hurricanes come and they're left with no help. So I would tune my activism and tune my actions, and also measure my success when they receive justice and when they receive the resources needed, and when change for them actually materializes, and celebrate then. So that's basically, it is not it is not a solution, it is just reality. What I can offer.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know who was first, Gary or yet another Jessica Besh, but yeah,
Jessica.
please, Gary. Jessica, okay, okay, go ahead.
Where is Jessica?
Hello, hello. Actually, I wasn't answering because I'm Francesco Cara from Milan in Italy. Hi, Gary. I don't know why I figure it's Jessica.
Okay.
Anyway.
Yeah, we realized that there was a.
Yeah,
I made a mistake with that one. Please
okay,
go ahead.
oh, don't worry. I will write my name afterwards. So Adrian, thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, and your insights. It's very what you shared with us is so important. We tend to look at the climate crisis as a crisis that affect everyone across the globe, and it is really essential to keep remind all of us that there are major asymmetries in the way the responsibilities and the consequences are distributed across the world. So thank you so much. I would like to share two thoughts. Hopefully they're relevant. The first thought is that I'm always surprised that we do not talk about the climate crisis in terms of loss and damage on a global level. And so I'm only partly surprised by the fact that it is so difficult to get the loss and damage narrative being accepted. You know, I'm a climate reality leader, so we have a big step in our training and in the presentations we give, where we give figures to the cost of loss and damage worldwide due to climate change. But I realize that around me, in many of the conversations, we tend to look at the investment needed to respond to climate to the climate crisis more than at the cost that the climate crisis creates, and our arguments would be so much stronger if we had figures for loss and damage, you know, per country, globally, and per country, etc., etc. And I really, it's data that personally I miss a lot. I collect it when I find it, but it's really hard work to do. The second thought I would like to share is about the NDC mechanism, so the nationally determined contribution mechanism. And I wonder whether this mechanism is also is not also slowing things down in terms of a loss and damage recognition, because it sends out a message that we are all equal in front of climate change. And so we have percentages of carbon reduction commitments taken by countries, and we know that percentages do not really convey the right image, which is an image of how much that country is really contributing towards the global climate crisis, and what that percentage means in relation to the full contribution. So hopefully I've been relevant, but I would like to have your thoughts on these two points. Thank you.
So I guess with the first question, and that I think it was about why loss and damage and there is no data, and why it's so hard. So one of the reasons well, there's two reasons why there's no sufficient data, and I think the political reason is because even though after 3 decades in 2015 we got an article that included loss and damage in the Paris Agreement, it was excluded from all the mechanisms that mitigation and adaptation are part of. For example, the global stocktake, that transparency mechanism. So there is no way or rules or place or instance to develop this article. We do have the Warsaw mechanism on loss and damage that is about technical assistance and so on, but that's not really part of the engine of the Paris Agreement. That's why NDCs, when they mention loss and damage, they do it because countries choose to, but not because there is a common structure where data is being gathered or assessed or criteria has been made, such as, for example, in terms of adaptation or mitigation, where there is a whole governance structure and technical tables that monitor and standardize and track this issue. So, and that is why we don't have a definition of loss and damage, not because you cannot have it, because there's lots of academic definitions of loss and damage, from legal perspective, from natural science perspective, but we don't have it because there's nobody within the UNFCCC that has been tasked to do this. And this is on purpose. This is completely on purpose. The same reason why there's a COP decision that does not allow to have any discussions on compensation of liability, because it was built into the Paris Agreement because the US requested it. Then the other issue that I think has to do more with the economic framework where loss and damage comes into. Well, loss and damage in climate change is the product of our economic system, about how our economic system has an energy matrix and how what value does this energy matrix generates. And the fact is that loss and damage is a negative externality of a negative environmental externality of this economic system. So it's built to not have a value, and is paid by those that have usually no rights, that are the marginalized and the poor. And that is why loss and damage is so hard to find numbers, not only because politically and technically there's no structure, but because our economic system does not really include negative externalities. And that's why we keep consuming as if our planet has no limits. And that's why we keep expanding. And that's why GDP doesn't work, because it just requires to expand infinitely, even though we have limited resources. And where does all the negative consequences of our economic system goes in terms of climate change, in terms of the energy matrix that it has? It goes to poor people. It goes to loss and damage. That's why there's no numbers. So that's the first question, and I forgot the second one. I don't know if you could remember it to me.
Thank you, Adrian. Was super clear. The second one was just a thought about the role NDCs play in giving the impression that we are all equal before climate change.
I think the NDCs. Well, they're not structured to include loss and damage. I mean, you could put it if you want to within your adaptation communication or in the adaptation section of your NDC in terms of data on loss and damage. But we'll have a publication soon on Latin American NDCs on loss and damage. And what you'll find is that they make no sense. You have the first NDC and then the updated NDC, and you check the loss and damage data. There's no correlation. It's not that the numbers relate or that you have an increase or that you have a methodology. And if you got the region, you have no way to compare it. So yeah, it could be if they were taught to include loss and damage, that you should think about that we have different responsibility and what will you do to address it. And then there you could have the discussion about differentiated common responsibilities on loss and damage. But currently it's even worse. NDCs are not built to include loss and damage. And that's why data doesn't make sense. And that's why you'll find 1 or 2 paragraphs per NDC on extremely vulnerable countries where you're supposed to get lots of data because they're really being impacted, but you don't have it. And so that's probably before talking about this responsibility issue, that the fact is that NDCs are not built to include loss and damage. So that's probably the bigger problem. And I guess, Gadi, you had your hand up too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I did have my hand up for a while, but I'm not sure. Certainly the loss and damage is something that is fundamental, but you know I'm in a war. And if you've looked at the war in Ukraine, the questions about loss and damage are pretty obvious, aren't they? And if we were to look at the future of what is happening in Ukraine and how it's impacting Europe, United States, and I think other countries in addition, we're going to see that loss and damage is not something that we can be very trivial about. We know that this is happening and we know it's going to get worse. And we know that we have to do something now, because if we don't do something now, the issues in the next 20 years will be very traumatic for many parts of the world, whether it's Latin America or whether it's the United States or whether it's the EU. We know that gas and oil is being sold by Russia, the billions and billions of Russian dollars or euros or whatever you want to call them. We know that it's all over the news. You know, why does Germany, why does Hungary, why do all you guys pay for all of that gas and oil? For God's sakes, don't you know it's destroying the damage? Oh, by the way, it's also screwing up Ukraine. It's killing people in Ukraine today. So loss and damage is something that's quite obvious in many places around the world, including Ukraine. And I would suggest that not only is it happening here, but if we don't get it under control soon, it's going to get worse. I would bet money on it. Of course, we can all say, oh, he's just an old guy, he doesn't know. But I would bet money that it's going to get worse in the next 2 decades if we don't start to do something about it. We just can't have intellectual conversations about it. We have to go much farther than that. And if you listen to people like Greta Thunberg and others, you know, who will tell you that all those, you know, oligarchs and all those people at the high levels of government in the ministries and the presidents and stuff, they're not paying attention to the world as it is today. Even young people are saying that all over Europe today, you know? So it's time for the hell with just talking about this. We got to do a lot more than talk. Activism has to come forward, in my personal opinion. That doesn't mean go out and shoot people, obviously. It means go out and tell people it has to change. We're not going to live like this any longer. And so loss and damage is going to be happening, not just here in Ukraine, but all over Europe. It's happening in Europe. We know that there's going to be food shortages all over Africa. We know that there's water shortages in all of the Latin and all of the countries in the Middle East. We know that water shortages are happening in different places around the world. People have to wake up and stop sitting on their behinds, sorry about that, and do something about this, in my personal opinion.
And I think you're correctly, and if you see it also from my region, and if you take Guatemala, one of the countries that we're studying that is highly affected by climate change, one of the issues is that it's very vulnerable. Why is that? Well, it spent 50 years on civil war. That leaves a mark in a country, and I think beyond these issues, for example, of war, when you're stuck between superpowers or powers in general, the issue with climate and loss and damage that sort of transcend this war or conflicts is that we will eventually lose control of our ability to stop loss and damage in terms that is accumulative, and in terms that it generates complex problems that begin to transcend our ability politically and economically to deal with them. You can stop a war eventually, but you cannot make a land be fruitful again. You can stop firing guns, but you cannot make it rain when desertification happens. And the consequences of that are so huge that it transformed the places where we argue about. I mean, it's just the basis of life. And that is something that we should realize. For example, when we have medium or short-term crises, either war or economic or whatever, that this issue of climate change, it will endure not decades, but it will define the coming centuries in terms of where can we live and how can we live. And that is something that no politician or economic system can control afterwards.
Bradley, go ahead.
So we're veering completely from the list of questions that we had, but in your opinion, because you mentioned earlier, and quite rightly, about the trauma of loss and damage in a community, it's difficult to quantify. It's hard to put a specific economic value, and it doesn't account for the grief. It doesn't account for the actual items that are lost and the sentimentality. So if tomorrow somehow loss and damage and some sort of mechanism came into force, what would a loss and damage solution look like in maybe two contexts? Maybe in one where an island has completely been erased, there's no more potable water on the island, sea level rise, you can't live there anymore. What would loss and damage look like to a community like that that's now had to be, it's been a forced human mobility beyond anyone being able to stay? And maybe what would climate justice look like for a community that has been ravaged by a hurricane?
I guess
Or
those
loss
are,
and damage solution, sorry, but also climate justice.
those are questions that sort of transcend the ability of mind to answer. But I think one of the key issues that at least I've come to realize with loss and damage and climate impacts is that even in the eventuality that we stabilize carbon emissions and hopefully even reduce them, when we start at least having the certainty that we won't go more, that circumstances won't be worse, that is one thing that would be very positive to people. Note that at least this is what we have. But one of the issues that at least women in the interviews that we have done in Central America are afraid of the climate, afraid what will come next year. Because it's not the same that you know how to deal with the storm. At least you have a superstorm, and this is the superstorm now that you're always going to have. This is the hurricane plus something that you will have, and that's it. But no, since emissions keep growing, you don't know if it's going to be bigger next time or drier next time, and when will it end. So if we at least had that, that would be very important. And then the damages are so big. I mean, for me, for my privilege, it's very hard to understand how people live in the conditions that they do now in the places that are extremely affected. I don't understand it. So what and I know that even developed countries won't be able to pay back or compensate these losses, but at least I think there should be a point where at least accepting responsibility would be one of significant step. And I think that is just out of decency. And that I think that this is something that is the thing that most annoys me and that is most difficult, because what everybody is afraid of is just accepting that you're responsible for it. And maybe we could start finding solutions if you were at least acknowledging that you were responsible for. And we know, it's easy to know that there won't be enough money or capacity or willingness to pay it anyways. And we see it with colonialism and imperialism and all those things that had happened in the past that had destroyed our societies. and so on, that there's no way to fix that, or slavery. There's no way to fix that. There's nothing you can give for damage that costs. It is the same thing, but instead of at least getting to the point of being honest about it, we keep eluding and avoiding responsibility. And I think that eventually should be the starting point of not only of restructuring our economic, restructuring our society. It is about acknowledging the problem. And I think from my experience within the UNFCCC and all these solutions that seem to drag on, and after 3 decades, you can see the solutions put forward within the status quo do not reduce emissions at all. It's because you do not acknowledge that our economic system has an energy matrix that destroys the planet and destroys communities. Once you do that, then maybe you can find alternatives, and then you take those big decisions, such as doing just transition, such as transforming your relationship with nature. But as long as you keep avoiding this reality, which is what actively our diplomats do, then there will be no solution. And I think, to me, that is how addressing loss and damage at least looks in the long term. Maybe in short term will be this mechanism that will provide some aid. Eventually, this loss and damage will stabilize. Somehow the climate impacts will stabilize. But in the long term, what we need is at least to acknowledge that this harm was made. That would be a big step forward to finding solutions.
Can I run the follow-up right away? I guess at the last climate summit, loss and damage was the word. It was one of the most popular topics. It's where you saw all the demonstrations of people protesting for loss and damage. Realistically, with a lot of political support and getting it on the agenda for COP27, when might it be possible to see loss and damage actually defined in an international climate governance level?
I think if a financial mechanism is decided to be created, that could easily happen in a couple of years, because you could choose to create it, and as many other mechanisms have, and then create the content of it, which is kind of responsible, because that's kind of how it works. You decide to create it, and then you have many meetings to decide how it works. I think that is not what will take more time. What will take lots of years, maybe a decade, is for actual results and actual resources and support to reach people that are being affected. And I think most of that support or compensation and so on will be for future loss and damage. Historical loss and damage, what we have felt for the past 2 decades, will probably fade away, and it'll be just integrated into the realities and context of what global South communities already lived through, as it has in many other issues. But yeah, I mean, and that's my pragmatic perspective. Hopefully it's better than this, but that is why I think could happen.
Do you think, sorry, do you think there would be a solution besides a financial mechanism? I've worked with Green Climate Fund projects before, and so we have issues of accessibility, trying to prevent corruption, and making sure that the money goes to the projects and not lining politicians' pockets. And it's become an issue. I think Costa Rica hasn't been able to get a project through because of all the requirements required to overcome to prove that they've done all their equality webinars and they have enough trained people, and it's a very costly process. Would there be, and that's not to mention the transparency issues with the Green Climate Fund, or the distribution of those funds not going out as they should. So would there be an alternative solution? Because I think right now we have 6 main climate funds through UNFCCC, arrangements on adaptation, but is there an alternative? Would it be aid, or what? How?
No,
And I don't like that answer either. So is there an alternative to a
yeah.
financial fund that would, or
So,
financial mechanism that also causes issues?
so the idea of this financial mechanism is to be structured differently than existing financial mechanisms. That is why it's proposed. If the idea was for it to function as current mechanisms do, then you would create a window of finance, or you modify an existing financial mechanism. But because of what you say, and because what we know how existing mechanisms of finance for climate finance work, they're inadequate for the type of work that we're talking about. I don't think that, for example, beyond, I am not against that beyond financial mechanisms, there be alternative means to provide aid. I think they're always welcome, but the reason that resources are provided should not be because of donations or charity or pledges, but because of responsibilities. So that's different. And for example, Germany's idea of a global shield, it sounds fine. I guess for some communities that have the resources that can pay insurance, that might work. But there's many communities that are already non-insurable and have no resources. So putting forward the global shield as the main solution is not really acceptable. But as an alternative or a peripheral solution or something that accompanies this addressing, then sure, it's something that could happen. But beyond that, there should be more actions, not only a financial mechanism, because you cannot solve everything with money. And you're not only losing money. There's a big chunk of loss and damage that is intangible. And for example, how do you remember the culture of an island? Or how do you remember a language that was lost? Or how do you remember a tradition that you are unable to continue because you no longer live in the place you did, or because the ingredients of the food that you have no longer exist? So there is way more that we should address. And then there is the psychological and identity aftermath of loss and damage that should be addressed, and the issue of justice itself. And I think the practices in things that are as extreme as for example, the Rwanda genocide, of just having open talks about what happened, might help us find peace eventually in this issue, because it is of this scale in terms of human impact and infringement of human rights. But we're not sealed yet because we don't even have a space to talk about. But eventually, all these alternatives should be on the table to talk with and in between people that are affected and those with privilege, such as me, that are not as affected.
So we are already a little bit over time, and we have sort of the last question on our list was, how can activists and also this group here, now that we know more about loss and damage, and you really put the nail on the word responsibility, and I would probably dream about it, but it's so true, thinking about climate change and in general, just colonialism, racism, all of those social injustice issues. How can we now create momentum for loss and damage?
So I think there's a lot of, and it is very mainstream now within the NGOs, the issue of loss and damage. But the more important thing that you could do is to track what your government says. Because it is what your delegates, it is what your prime ministers, your ministers, your presidents think and state in terms of recognizing that this is a present issue, that they're responsible for it, and that the response should be in terms of based on a human rights-based approach. What is the most important? Because what we find at the end is that there's no progress, because then you have 4 people. You have a representative from Switzerland that talks and talks and talks and tries to avoid responsibility during a negotiation and no progress is made, or a representative from the EU that tries to digress into matters that are not relevant. So trying to push for governments to have outspoken and concrete positions on this that recognize the severity and the responsibility is very important. And that's something that we are tasked to in the Global South. I track and push and talk and instigate my own country, the negotiators, to have a position and provide them with data and position of our own to show them that it is a reality in our country. It is a priority for me, and I'm sitting right beside them in the negotiations, waiting for them to speak. And for example, in the ESB, we did a tweet that was very interesting. The Costa Rican delegate got the word to speak in the Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage, and then she said it was a mistake. I didn't say anything. So for me, it was such a missed opportunity and such a bad moment politically, so shameful to have the floor to speak on our behalf, even if you didn't meant to at least support the idea of getting a financial mechanism. But if you then choose just to say that it was a mistake and to not speak, knowing that it's so hard to get out the message, then it's something that I find unacceptable. And this is basically what we keep pushing, trying to make this issue something that they know we follow, and that there's expectations, and that there is a legal and moral expectation on their words and on their possessions from our side.
Okay, thank you so much. I think, yeah, it was very informative, and in general, we should just hold our governments and decision makers more accountable. We should really act and spread the word and raise awareness. I mean, there's so much awareness still to do about climate justice in general and loss and damage, and we are so grateful to be cooperating with you, and also having our climate justice interest group, Bradley, as an expert and as an engine. And we were actually hoping to also have an action meeting now in the end, but since we went way over time, and it's also good because we have to talk about this, Zsolt and I were thinking that we should maybe move the action meeting to a different date, and also see whether some other people who are interested in this topic in climate justice can also join, and then we can discuss next steps. Is that also okay for you, Bradley? Okay, great. Then we will also circulate an email and see whether we can find a date very soon to talk about how we can act and hold our politicians accountable. All right. Any last words from anyone?
Just a big thank you for a wonderful, wonderful session. I learned personally so much. So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, same from me.
No, thank you all for the invitation and also for your time. I think it's always very important to appreciate when people take time to get engaged in issues. And not everybody does it, and it takes a lot of effort to grow politically. And I think I would congratulate you all of you for this effort. And I love if we could collaborate in the future. And thank you a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.